We're heading into day 2 of jury deliberations in the case against former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort.
Yesterday, the jury in the federal trial sent 4 questions to the judge. Those queries asked for clarification of reporting requirements for foreign financial accounts. They also asked the definition of reasonable doubt and clarification on some evidence in the case.
To talk more about the trial, the Mueller investigation, and more is former U.S. Attorney Kendall Coffey. Kendall, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
What do you think about the Manafort trial right now?
Yeah, read the tea leaves for us.
Yeah, that's right. You got to we promised we would hold against you if you're wrong in a couple of days.
It's very, very uphill for Paul Manafort, as we know. Lots of evidence of foreign bank accounts and money that wasn't reported and all these things. But his team has to have a little bit of glimmer of hope just from the question that their jurors want to know more about reasonable doubt, because there are certainly cases where that can be the final thing that at least gives them a few holdout jurors, because a hung jury here would be a big victory for the defense.
And just so I can understand, reasonable doubt in this case would be, and I know that the trial probably is trying to bring it up in a bunch of different ways, but that Manafort didn't know,
didn't intentionally hide this money,
yeah, that
right?
it was that it wasn't willful to hide the money, or that he went on the advice of somebody else. I mean, how could you even conjure reasonable doubt when you're talking about bank accounts, which they know they're there, they know they didn't pay taxes?
The reasonable doubt would be the combination of he forgot, he wasn't looking closely, busy guy, makes lots of documents, lots of decisions every day. And by the way, the evil Rick Gates did everything. So those are the kind of things that they hope will get some jurors to think reasonable doubt. And look, it's tough, but there got to be some
Sounds
people,
reasonable.
Okay, but there got to be some people in that jury that don't like Rick Gates. And the defense did everything they could to put Rick Gates on trial, the cooperator, against Paul Manafort. Meanwhile, the prosecution's very skillfully saying the star witness here is the documents, not Rick Gates.
What did you think of the defense's approach?
I thought that was the only set of cards they could play. They have a very tough case, lots of bad documents. So try to get the jury to think about Rick Gates, the possibility of mistakes with all these documents involved, and hope that there's a couple jurors there that are offended enough by Rick Gates or confused enough by the documents, because this is a documents and a fraud and a foreign bank accounts, a bunch of issues, that they get a couple holdout jurors.
Now, this isn't the only legal jeopardy that Paul Manafort faces.
No.
Preview for us what's coming in the next trial.
Well, the next case is going to involve money laundering. It's going to involve the question of whether he was an unregistered foreign agent. In some ways, it's an even bigger document trial. So there's not an easy road for Paul Manafort, even if somehow he won this case. He's got a very tough case down the road in just a few months.
If the most positive thing that's likely to happen here does occur for Paul Manafort, which would be a hung jury, what would that mean?
Well, a hung jury would mean that after all of this, the Mueller investigation couldn't get a conviction. And isn't it enough already? Because I think the hung jury in a normal case just means, yeah, you try the case again. Happens all the time. But here in this political environment, I think a hung jury would be heavily emphasized as some kind of statement.
Isn't that what happened?
Gone on too long.
Senator Menendez, by the way, was it a hung jury?
Hung jury, and it was not retried.
Right.
It was not
so there's already a precedent for a recent, very high-profile political case.
It does happen, and I have no idea what the president would ever do with his Trump presidential pardon power, but he could also say, look, this poor man's already been on trial once. Enough is enough. They couldn't prove it. I'm putting an end to this charade.
This wouldn't shock me, by the way.
This would not shock me either. He certainly has exercised his pardon powers for people who have been friendly to him in the past. So that, I think, is something that Paul Manafort is probably hoping for as well. On another issue, there's been this ongoing skirmish between the special counsel and the president and Rudy Giuliani over whether the president is going to sit for an interview, whether Mueller might subpoena the president, whether that is even something that can happen. What is your view of whether Mueller can in fact subpoena the president?
I mean, I think ultimately he can. I think that, we've had Supreme Court reactions, including obviously in the Nixon case, that strongly seem to support that theme. It would be a fight. It would be a mess. And of course, you've got folks that are trying to work this out with some kind of negotiation. But I think Giuliani knows his client well enough to know that if he lets President Trump go into an open-ended interview with all kinds of issues being talked about, that there's almost no way the president can get through that without some kind of damage, lots of contradictions, and a risk of somebody being able to put the word false statement and obstruction, because here and there the president flatly contradicted things that the prosecutors believed to be true.
You worked with, hopefully, well, for some of us, future Supreme, sorry, Krystal, not to speak for Krystal, perhaps future Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh on the Elian Gonzalez case. What can you tell us about how that went and what he was like working that issue?
Well, he was terrific. Brilliant, smart, nice.
Tell me more.
And he actually came in.
Good carpool dad, I heard.
Yeah.
Well, but he came in, we lost the appeal. And he and his folks came in, volunteers, to try to see if they could take the situation we had and give it a fair shot in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, where, of course, he knew the issues very, very well. And in particular, I think his interest was something then that continues now, and it's administrative agencies. And do they have too much power? Too much power to decide the law? And that actually was a significant issue in the Elian case.
You think that he would be a suitable Supreme Court justice?
Well, if we're allowed to use our own legal philosophies, that's one set of questions. If you're just looking at a high-quality, brilliant, good guy that anybody would be proud to have a friend, absolutely.
One thing that has been raised as a question of Kavanaugh is his view of executive power. You're talking about the agencies having too much power. He seems so comfortable having a lot of power vested in the president. So if the subpoena question were to go to a Supreme Court that had Kavanaugh on it, how do you think that might shake out? I
think he may be very reluctant, based on what he's written, to say that the president has to sit for a subpoenaed statement or grand jury testimony.
Wow.
The
president would like to hear that.
You can perhaps find it commendable, perhaps find it an element of concern, but after all his hard-charging work with the investigation of Ken Starr, a few years later he wrote articles saying that was probably a mistake. We shouldn't be investigating a sitting president. It's just bad for the country. So I think that's the position that he would take with him on the Supreme Court.
All right, Kendall Coffey, thanks for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thanks
Great to have
for including
you.
me.
Thanks for stopping by.